So where do those additives in the recycled plastics end up?
They will end up in our food chain. So if measures are not taken, then the chances is that we are consuming these chemicals.
The National Plastic Products Company plant at Odenton, Maryland. A firm that plays one specialized part in the manufacture of a product that makes life a little easier and better for all of us.
In the 1950s, about 5 million tonnes of plastic was produced every year. By 2015, it was 381 million tonnes. And now, every year, hundreds of thousands of tonnes of plastic waste ends up in our oceans. Awareness about plastic pollution has increased astronomically in recent years, and now 193 nations, that's every country in the UN, has agreed to an ambitious and legally binding treaty to try and deal with the issue. But here at Brunel University, they're finding out it's not just the environment we need to worry about, it's ourselves. Dr. Eleni Lacovidou is an expert in waste management and has researched extensively into the reusability of plastics and their potential health effects.
So we've seen that at the production stage, there is a number of additives being used to provide some functionalities and properties on the plastics. And we wanted to find out what happens on these additives. When recycled plastic returns back into the system, where do these chemicals go? So we embarked on this study and we found that for the PET bottles.
So the PET bottles are those clear drink bottles?
Exactly, clear or color, it doesn't matter, beverage bottles. We found that there is also additives, but there's also non-intentionally added chemicals that end up on the plastic across its entire life cycle, which means that if recycling processes are not properly done, there is a chance of chemicals being returned back to the system when we recycle the plastic.
So where do those additives in the recycled plastics end up?
Well, they will end up in our food chain because these bottles are supposed to be used for bottle-to-bottle recycling. So if measures are not taken, then the chances is that we are consuming these chemicals.
So it comes down to the cleaning stage of the plastic?
Yes.
It seems quite daunting because we know we need to recycle, but you're telling us that even when we recycle, there's a problem that we have to deal with.
There are many gaps. Recycling is not bad. It's actually very good for the environment. It's very good for plastics as well, especially the PET beverage bottles. It's just the way that the recycling is done that has to be monitored very closely, and we need to have a harmonized quality assurance stage to make sure that the plastic that is created by the reprocessing facilities is of good quality so that it can be used in the new bottles.
I see no objections. It is so decided.
Inger Andersen is the Under Secretary General and Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme and one of the chief architects of the Plastics Treaty.
We want to do this. We want it to be legally binding. We want to reduce overall plastics in the economy, and we want to stop it going into the oceans. So unanimously, 193 nations decided that they will start negotiating on the text, and they will have this finished in 3 years.
In everything I've read about the treaty, you talk about removing plastic from the supply chain. I don't think I really understand what that means.
Well, I guess we will always need plastics, and we should understand plastic is not the enemy. We need it in medicine, we need it in construction, we need it in electronics, etc., etc. But once we've created it, instead of discarding it, we took it out of the environment into the economy, fine and dandy. We should not discard it back into the environment as waste. We should keep it in a circular mode so that it remains in the economy for as long as possible, and in some cases in perpetuity. How to do that? Well, one is reducing the kind of plastics that we use that is single use. I mean, that is just yesterday's news, but we also need to recycle and obviously reuse, and we need to refuse. There are places where we simply don't need it, so that we can increase the amount of recycled content in the plastics we have in the economy, reduce the amount of raw polymer that comes into the economy. Now, it's going to be hard, and you can compare some countries, poorer countries, that will have to They import a lot, so their things are contained. So how do we deal with extended responsibility of the producers so that they have a sense of responsibility to the market end? There are a number of issues to be worked out, but that's what the 3 years will be used for.
And what are some of these dangerous additives that we're talking about?
It's a range of chemicals. In our study was a systematic evidence mapping. So we collected studies from different regions around the world, and we looked into the results they produce in relation to the chemicals that can migrate from the plastic bottle to the beverage, or it could be found during the reprocessing stage. Doesn't necessarily mean that the plastics that we have in our system are polluted and are unsafe. What it means is that we have to make sure that we check the plastic against a list of chemicals, including bisphenol A, abbreviated as BPA, antimony, and other phthalates that are usually found in plastic and which can accumulate in human organisms and cause health implications. Phthalates is a group of chemicals which includes also chemicals that affect the organisms, endocrine disruptors, and thus they can accumulate in our systems, and in the long term they can result to health implications. But these are everywhere in our system. They don't just come from the plastics, but we have to make sure that they are on plastics, because that way we can limit the human exposure to these substances.
So BPA, for example, what are the health implications of that?
It's got very important implications. For example, it's been found that it can affect the reproduction in men, it can affect embryo development in pregnant women, it can also be linked with cancer.
Several recent studies also suggest that BPA and phthalates may also play a role in the worldwide obesity crisis by disrupting some of our metabolic pathways. So what can we do as individuals to keep plastics out of the environment and out of our bodies? I love the other thing you mentioned too. What is it? Recycle, reuse and refuse?
Reduce, reuse, recycle, and then yes, refuse. And it is this idea, do you want a bag? No, I got my own. Do you need a cup? No, I got my own. Because many times we can actually live better and healthier without these disposable items that we gather during a normal working day. We don't need them. And so it's being aware of that. I think our kids are better at it than us. We are good at drinking at glasses. Who needs a straw? I mean, this is not hard. So I think, listen to your children is a good advice, isn't it?
I guess much of the next 3 years will be working out how to help poorer nations who've been disproportionately affected by this issue.
If you take Europe, well, there you have got your systems, you've got your tax and incentives and so on and so forth. And you can regulate, but what do you do in Guinea-Bissau or in Burkina Faso or in Bhutan? It's not, or in a small island state in the Pacific. So these are complex issues. This is where we need to understand that there may be tiers of levels of ambition that, because many of these smaller countries are importing materials that will need to be contained in something. And these containment of the stuff that they import will likely include plastic containers. And then what to do once they arrive there. Now, can they go back in empty containers? This is what we know has happened in other trade routes for some time, frankly, until China stopped it. The containers that went to the US to a large extent had plastic waste coming back from the US to China. That has now ceased. And so the US will have to deal with its waste stream nationally. There are many, many dimensions to be discussed, including also the kind of plastics that we produce. Some plastics have what we call forever chemicals, i.e. persistent organic pollutants, and that needs to be eliminated from much of the plastic supply, obviously. And when you buy a bag of chips or something, often there's a metal lining. The moment you put a metal lining in a plastic thing, can't be recycled. So there are also some regulatory settings that needs to be introduced that simply makes it more amenable to recycling. But it is interesting that immediately before the United Nations Environment Assembly, some 90 CEOs, including the Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Mars, etc., that use plastic to contain their commodities, signed up for a declaration saying, we actually want a legally binding instrument to reduce and end plastic pollution, because it tarnishes the brand. And so if there is a legally binding, universal, globally accepted agreement, that also levels the playing field across the board. Nobody has a competitive advantage. So that's what might be different about this convention, that we have to have industry take the lead and show the way and show what is possible.
It's all finished. I know you want more Razor stories, so don't forget to like, comment and subscribe and hit the bell button below for notifications. We'll see you soon.